Climate change can be described as the persistent change in temperature, rains, and other atmospheric factors on Earth. It is mainly caused by human beings, such as burning of fossil fuels, deforestation, and industrial processes. Levi and Hess states that the average temperature on Earth has risen continuously within the last century, causing severe alterations in weather patterns, which are more frequent and severe in extreme weather events including heat waves, floods, and hurricanes. The effect of these changes are not only on the environment, but also on the human society, especially people that live in sensitive areas. Climate change does not affect everyone equally, as the developed countries could afford the adaptation, where areas where countries and marginalized populations are frequently at a higher risk. The primary cause of increase in carbon emission in the world, which is a major contributor to climate change, has been industrialization. According to Semyonov and Yakovenko, that the Industrial Revolution started the drastic rise in carbon dioxide emission when industry started to use fossil fuels as the source of energy. As the years have gone by, these emissions have accumulated in the atmosphere, entrapping heat and leading to an increase in the global temperature. With the world economy becoming larger, the emission of carbon has increased, especially in the countries that have recently been industrialized. Although it is the wealthier nations that are the most prolific emitters, the effects of increasing carbon levels are more unevenly distributed to the developing countries, which simply have a smaller amount of resources that they can use to prevent and adapt to challenges in the environment. This unequal carbon footprint between developing and developed countries has resulted in an increase in demand of international policies that could be used to fairly distribute responsibilities in cutting down of emissions and supporting the vulnerable areas. Environmental inequalities can be defined as the unfair distribution of the exposure of the marginalized groups to environmental risk, which further increases the social and health disparities. According to Clark and Miles, such communities are often made out of low income groups and people of color, and they are more probable to live in a location that is susceptible to pollution, toxic waste, and impacts of climate change, such as overheating and flooding. It is an unequal exposure that is credited to a combination of factors including the historical practices of redlining, land use policy discrimination, and powerlessness. The health problems are also extremely numerous, such as respiratory problems, cardiovascular disease, and psychological disorders as a result of the environmental hazards. It is the idea of ecological inequality that is applied to defend the efforts of providing an overall policy solution to the given environmental problem, which considers both the environmental and social inequity of the people in terms of providing sound environmental protection and equitable access to a good environment. Climate change affects the economically disadvantaged groups more, and therefore it is harder for them to recover after an occurrence of a natural disaster and disturbance in the environment. According to Perry, the less moneyed societies are poorly equipped to counter or reclaim the losses caused by climate changes, such as flooding, hurricanes, and drought. Economic hardship is brought about in the long run as a result of destroying homes, businesses, and infrastructure, and this puts the communities in a loop of poverty. Moreover, these populations are usually unprepared to recover their lives following a disasters because they do not have insurance to cover or savings to support them, making them vulnerable to the next climatic condition. In such a way, economic inequality enhances the impacts of climate change as it puts the disadvantaged groups even further at a disadvantage. The indigenous communities get in the brink of climate change as they have a special vulnerability because of their strong relationship with land, water, and ancient lifestyle. Perry argues that the effects of climate change, including the increase in sea levels, weather related extreme events, and altered ecosystem, endangers the land and resources that the indigenous people rely on to ensure their cultural, spiritual, and economic well being. Indigenous communities in most instances do not have access to the platforms and resources to make decisions to adjust changes. Loss of the land and natural resources not only destabilizes their traditional ways of living but also adds to the loss of their culture. Thus, indigenous people are disproportionately impacted by climate change since they have contributed minimally to the issue but are the most vulnerable with the highest burden of the problem. Climate change is increasingly becoming a major factor in migration, as individuals have to move out of their residence because of the change in environment like increased sea levels, extreme weather patterns, and drought. As it is stated by Perry, these people are also known as climate refugees and encounter not only environmental issues but also social and economical injustices in their new residence. Climate refugees are usually vulnerable due to the lack of resources, legal safeguards, and social support system that would help them to reconstruct their lives. Climate refugees will rise in numbers as the frequency and severity of climate related events rises. This increasing migration poses an additional burden on the host communities, which increases the competition for resources and possible tensions on migration policies. So it is necessary that the country should mitigate these threats by acting in line and providing equal opportunities to deal with the situation. Climate change is another factor that enhances gender inequalities, particularly in the developing world. Women working in agriculture are often excluded for the decision making. Clark and Miles state that the consequences of climate change include crop failures, water shortage, and severe weather conditions have a disproportionate effect on women due to the role they play in these regions. There's also a high probability of women being less accessible to resources, which include education, land ownership, and making decisions, and thus it became more difficult to adjust to the effects of climate. Gender inequality also adds to the vulnerability of women in most areas, which do not allow them to fully engage in climate resilience plans and policy formulation. Gender inequality is one of the issues that should be addressed to develop efficient climate adaptation policies. Environmental justice is the value that everyone, irrespective of race, ethnicity, or income, must equally enjoy a healthy environmental and benefit to avert environmental damage. State that environmental justice focus on the equitable allocation of environmental benefits and burden so that communities of color and other vulnerable groups would not be disproportionately at risk for being exposed to environmental hazard. The justice policies will be addressed by providing historical injustices with the establishment of such structures that can empower the poor communities to be heard in the process of decision making. Fair measure are some of the ways through we can aid in achieving social equity and introduce more suitable and fair solutions to the problems of climate change. Climate reparations are a concept which implies that the richest countries who have been the greatest contributors to climate change should pay countries and or communities which are the most negatively impacted by climate change. Perry notes that this notion of reparation is based on fairness and justice, since marginalized groups, particularly in the global south, are the most affected by climate change, yet they have the least impact on the issue. The reparation might be financial aid, transfer of technology, and building to enable the affected community to adjust and recover from the effects of the climate change. The strategy recognizes the historical background of environmental depletion and seeks to rectify the inequalities brought by unequal role to climate change. In conclusion, the issue of climate change should not solely be forced on reducing the damage inflicted on the environment, but also on the inequalities that it aggravates. Climate change is a social justice issue that crosscuts with vulnerable and marginalized population groups because it is a global problem. The research states that there is a need to institute policies that give priority to such communities to make them have access to resources such as clean air, water, food, and develop adaptive solutions in a manner that is inclusive and everybody gets to have a say. Moving forward, we need to keep in mind that the effectiveness of any climate action will largely depend on the concept of fairness, which implies that the special attention should be given to those people among population that are left out. And in terms of socio-economic status, in order to make sure they're equipped with the resources that are needed and the assistance that they also need to be able to deal with the changing climate. It is only via cooperation that we can assure not only a viable but also an equitable future for everyone